Welcome to this session of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and this year by the United States Philatelic Classic Society. Our presenter for this session will be Tim O'Connor, and the title for this presentation is The Rise of the American Post, 1639 to 1776. This session's speaker, Tim O'Connor, is a graduate of Dartmouth College and Tufts Medical School. His lifetime in philately includes memberships and positions in a number of societies and clubs, including the American Philatelic Society, the U.S. Philatelic Classic Society, the Collectors Club, the British North American Philatelic Society, and the Royal Philatelic Society London, amongst others. He has also authored and co-authored several articles, many of which have concerned the postal history and the postal laws of Boston and the colonial United States. His articles have appeared in many of the more notable postal history journals, such as the Postal History Journal of the U.S. and the Chronicle of the U.S. Classics Postal Issues. Now, due to the wonders of the virtual world in which this presentation is being given, we are very fortunate to have as a guest speaker for Mr. O'Connor, one of the founding fathers of the United States, a writer, printer, political philosopher, politician, Freemason, scientist, inventor, humorist, civic activist, statesman, diplomat, and postmaster, Mr. Benjamin Franklin. With that, and with a little indulgence, the 2020 Postal History Symposium presents Mr. Benjamin Franklin and his presentation titled The Rise of the American Post, 1739 to 1776. Mr. Franklin?
Thank you, Director Tiffany. It's an honor to be here. I have some experience with post office matters, and I feel competent to discuss the rise of an American post. We're going to go through the years 1639 to 1782, and I hope to show you some brilliant innovations that took place. Certainly, early posts addressed a number of needs in a growing society. For this discussion today, we'll be talking about a number of firsts: North American Post House, attempted multi-colony post, and post road, the first durable multi-colony post. We'll talk about transatlantic modifications designed to speed mail across the Atlantic Ocean, as well as other reasons. We'll talk about a unique American influence, the American colonists' rebellious responses to intolerable actions as they related to the post office, and finally, the formation of an American post. I was born in Boston in 1706, and it's wonderful to talk about the first post house in all of North America. The Massachusetts General Court in 1639 created an official designation for Richard Fairbanks' house. His house was to be a post office of sorts where letters could be deposited, and then it was Fairbanks' task to get those letters on board vessels with ship's captains, reliable folks who would sail the dangerous seas. He was allowed to receive 1 penny for this task. I imagine that ship's captains brought mail to his house, and citizens could pick up their letters there. This letter from April of 1651 is the first letter that I know of that could have been handled in Fairbanks' house. It's addressed to Mr. Nathaniel Maverick, who's in Barbados. The letter is written by his father, Samuel Maverick, and Samuel has added a superscription Mr. Furness, I pray you be careful of this letter. If you stay tomorrow, I shall bring you some other letters, other papers, perhaps. Yours, Samuel Maverick. Maverick is an interesting fellow. He was actually on Noddle's Island in Massachusetts Bay 6 years before Jonathan Winthrop and the Puritans arrived. Interesting man. We have to go to 1687 before there's further evidence of this unique Boston post house. And this letter, these for Jonathan Usher, Esquire, at his house in Boston, New England, present. That's a formal addressing form. These, the name of the recipient, present, is a contraction of a courtly designation. The letter has a talismanic inscription, QDC, in the bottom, for Quem Deus Conservat. May Lord protect the bearer of this letter. And the author in Barbados has noted that this letter goes with Jonathan Turner, commander, on a Boston ketch, which I assume is a ketch. The important part of the letter is a superscription on the address, on the side of the address panel. This reads, Esquire Usher, pray if, marvelous if, a very scrawly kind of if, pray if you be pleased to put ye enclosed aboard some ship bound for England. He's talking to Usher. And so, to accomplish that task, and so to be put in ye post house, to be transferred to ye place directed by superscription. And that's how the post house was supposed to work. Usher received this letter, which clearly contained other letters destined to go to England, again from Barbados, and Fairbanks was allowed to charge a penny for every letter that he handled. We go back now from 1687 to New York in 1672. Remember that New York had been New Amsterdam, but in 1666, I believe, Peter Stuyvesant surrendered the town without a shot being fired. The English took it, and that was the conclusion of the first Anglo-Dutch Sea War. At this point in time, the Dutch, the Low Countries, the Orange, had the world's largest fleets, Marines capable of landing and taking command. They were a force to be reckoned with. So the Second Anglo-Dutch Sea War is ongoing in 1672, and Francis, Governor Lovelace of New York, realizes that New York would be a target. He receives word that there's an outbreak of war, and he is writing to Jonathan Winthrop, governor of Connecticut, who's in a military mind, as well as a governor of Connecticut, a son of John Winthrop of Boston. Lovelace proposes that there is a route to be identified and a post rider who would go from New York to Waterbury, to Hartford, to Boston, carrying mail, prepaid mail, which would help underwrite the running and maintenance of this post. He asked Governor Winthrop to identify able woodsmen who would plot a path, the most expeditious path between Hartford and New York and Hartford and Boston. This remains today. It's the Boston Post Road. You can see on this letter from December 1672 that the first postal marking of North America appears. It is a post-paid, one of three such markings of the Lovelace Post. In addition, Lovelace has signed the letter. This letter resides in the Connecticut State Library. This letter from February 17th, it's docketed as 1672, but we have to realize that this is a Julian calendar, and it really is 1673. This is the response to the prior letter. This letter comes from Governor Leverett in Boston, and he's responding to Winthrop, who's acting as a middleman. This letter is also superscribed post-paid, and it tells that the Boston merchants don't feel like they have any real reason to commit monies to maintenance of a post writer, etc. That might only be benefiting Governor Lovelace in New York. This post is short-lived, about 16 months. This letter is from the Mass Historical Society, and it ends badly for Lovelace, who loses New York and is ultimately hanged or beheaded in the Tower of London. We move now to the first attempted multi-colony post that's actually going to be somewhat successful. Thomas Neal was granted a patent or a license to farm the North American colonies, and he hires Andrew Hamilton, who's able to negotiate with New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, the Jerseys, and Penn. Hamilton was the ex-governor of the Jerseys, and he set up a system of riders to go between the major towns of those colonies. Rates would be based on distance. A very popular part of the Neal patent laws were that accounts could be payable in local money. This was not a financial success, and the patent was sold back to the Crown in 1707. But the post that it represented was so popular with the colonies that every colony, subsequently to the closure of the patent in 1707, passed laws funding and supporting the continuation of a Neal patent post. And so I like to call this the Neal patent period, extending to 1711. Maryland and Virginia joined in this period. The Neal patent laws codified that mail on mail dealing with matters of public concernment could go free, and it was the basis for allowing, quote, for His Majesty's service, end quotes, a designation that allowed free mail. This is a letter to old friend Jonathan Usher. He's now His Majesty's Lieutenant Governor of the province of New Hampshire, and this letter is attempting to catch up with a renegade who's attempting to flee New Hampshire, leaving behind many debts. The letter goes haste, post haste, and travels with the assistance of public officials, praying all justices and constables to be aiding and assisting. So an express letter of sorts, and an example of a letter of public concernment. This is a letter from a number of years later, August 31st, 1697. It's written during the War of the League of Augsburg, which was the name for the European conflict that trickled down into North America. It's a war between Protestants and Catholics. And this letter is to Captain John Hill at His Majesty's fort in Saco. So the earliest letter into Maine. It also goes on for His Majesty's service. You can see that the capital F is really looks like two Fs. Saco at that point in time, as well as Fort Pemaquid, are the frontier attempting to deal with the Catholic French holdings north of those towns into the Acadia region, Quebec, etc. Also in the Neal patent period is this letter to the Honorable Nathaniel Byfield, judge of quarter sessions in Bristol, Massachusetts then, but it's now Bristol, Rhode Island. And this letter is franked by Jonathan Campbell, postmaster of Boston. Again, the capital F looks like two Fs attached. So it's a frank of Jonathan Campbell. At this point in time, there's no legal reason for postmasters per se to have a franking privilege. Rather, it seems that the Honorable Nathaniel Byfield is allowed to receive letters of public concernment. This letter and its contents have been elegantly discussed by Mark Schwartz, and it deals with the theft of a tankard. And eventually the tankard is described in Jonathan Campbell's newspaper, and the rightful owner shortly will receive their property back. In the Neal patent period, that is after 1708, this is the first non-archival town and rated letter. This letter is to Mr. David Jeffries and Company, merchants in Boston, NY for New York, and 12D, 12D, 12 pence sterling, paid for the postage to go from New York to Boston. Also in the late Neal patent period is this marvelous letter during the War of the Spanish Succession, also known as Queen Anne's War in North America. At this point in time in the conflict, a expedition against Quebec is being planned from New York and New England. Lord Harley of the Crown hierarchy and war councils has decided that it would be ideal to have a means to get communications back and forth between North America in as rapid a fashion as possible. This type of plan was the reason for the start of the dumber packets, which went between England and the Caribbean. This packet was set up by Harley and would leave Bristol, England, and go to New York. The Bristol packet or the Harley packet sailed during Queen Anne's War, which didn't last all that long. There are 5 known New York markings of the Bristol packet. This particular letter left Philadelphia May 2, 1711, on board the Bristol. It departed May 5th from New York and arrived in Bristol, England on June the 6th, and then made its way to London in a closed bag, arriving in London June 14th, bishop mark in the lower left-hand corner. The postmark in Philadelphia, post paid to New York, double weight, and then it bears the New York hand stamp. This is the first hand stamp postal marking applied to a North American city. Going back to the letter is rated double weight, so 2N in the upper right-hand corner, and the letter that entitles the letter to go from New York to Bristol, and then in a closed bag to London, and then in London the letter is dispatched to Liverpool, which is more than 80 miles away. It is now being rated in England as part of the Act of Queen Anne, which we will see shortly. So the distance of over 80 miles is 4 pence. Double weight would be 8 pence. And so in the above the Philadelphia superscription is the London superscription. In all, 2N8, 2 shillings and 8 pence. Well, we mentioned the Act of the Queen Anne. This was an act for establishing a general post office for all of Her Majesty's dominions and for settling a weekly sum out of the revenues thereof for the service of the war and other Her Majesty's occasions. So they're using the post office to generate money to defray expenses for these wars in North America and in the continent. It's a huge act with many clauses. It really spells out how the post office is to function going forward. There's a lot of meat in the Act of Queen Anne. There's central control in England, and this translates to the main post office in New York in North America. Rates are based on in sterling. Rates are written in sterling. They're based on weight and distance. There are rates for ship letters. Pound and rate markings are mandated. Weigh and buy letters are discussed, including penalties for postwriters not turning in letters collected on the way or on the buy. And their penalties are proclaimed in the law. This law was effective June 1, 1711 in North America. And this is the very first way letter that we've seen as part of the Queen Anne's law. This letter is from Newport, Rhode Island. The capital R is the designation for Newport, R for Rhode Island, and is the town post office. This letter is addressed to Mr. Joseph Prout, the town clerk of Boston. So I think this is the kind of letter that a postwriter might have picked up and put in his pocket, but since the letter is going to an official official town clerk of Boston, I think he realized it was a good idea not to ask Joseph Prout for a penny, but to mark it on the letter like he was supposed to, and we get this lovely postal marking from 1714. As per the Queen Anne, a letter from Boston to New York was 12 pence. This letter goes to the Right Honorable Colonel Peter Schuyler at New York. The Schuyler family is very important as they have a number of Indian outposts beyond Albany and are clearly able to monitor the French activity among the Native Americans up there and act as an early warning trouble. This from February 16th, 1721, but now it's 1722 according to the Gregorian, 1720, It is 1721 in the Gregorian calendar. The Act of Queen Anne specified that the post rate to Boston from Portsmouth or Piscataqua, New Hampshire, was 4 pence, despite it being over 6 months. The Act of Queen Anne also had an unusual rate, which was the post office was allowed to charge 1 penny for the task of taking a letter and putting it on board a ship. This letter from New York, May 20, 1734, is destined for London, and the vessel and its captain, their departure has been advertised in New York papers, Boston papers, and the writer in New York knows that that would be the first vessel leaving for England. And so he writes, he pays for his letter to get to that ship in Boston from New York. So the postmark is NY, New York, paid to Boston for DWT, 4 pennyweights, and 8, the 8 lies on its side, isn't that nice? 8 grains of silver. So 4 DWT is really 12 pence. That's the rate between Boston and New York. And the extra 8 grains is equal to 1 penny, this special rate to put a letter on board a ship. Exact sailing data for this date is not found. Only the advertisements that the ship would leave at some time in the future. We do know that the letter arrived in London 6 July and was rated 4. Above the via Boston, that squiggle is a 4, which includes, I think, one penny for the ship's captain and 3 pence for some amount of inland travel to Samuel Stoke, the merchant. So perhaps he's on the outskirts of London, and this letter didn't go on one of the penny posts. So 4 pence in England. Following are 2 letters, which are in a sense similar. This one is from London, October 1735, and it goes to the Chesapeake. And the letter lands at Marlborough and is thus postmarked Marlborough ship, 3D, 3 pennyweights, and 16 grains. The letter goes to Philadelphia. 9 pence sterling is the equivalent of 3 pennyweights, and 16 grains equal 2 pence for the ship's captain. This letter is similar to this letter, which is from 3 days earlier, October 17th, 1735, also to Flexney in Philadelphia. This letter landed at Annapolis and is rated similar to the prior letter, 3 DWT and 16 grains. These are the first Maryland postmarks known. The superscription asks for forwarding. NB, nota bene, provided BF, David Flexney, should be absent. This to be forwarded after him to the place where he may be bound for from said place, Philadelphia. Titled superscription in the lower left-hand corner is per VM, Maryland. These 2 letters represent a phenomenon in the development of North American post, which is to say that certain commercial and economic factors dictated or provided opportunity for the transmission of letters. Many vessels were headed into the Chesapeake in late autumn and early winter. So this letter would have taken about 6 weeks to arrive from London. So we're talking late December sometime, and the tobacco crop would have dried by this point in time. And just as important, the waters of the Chesapeake were no longer hospitable to the damaging teredo worm, which was capable of eating through wood hulls. So the right time for all the vessels that would arrive to transport the valuable tobacco crop back to England arrived in Chesapeake area, December, January, loaded their boats and headed back to England. This process is one of many reviewed by Professor Ian K. Steele in his book, The English Atlantic, 1675 to 1740. It is an excellent book. Much of it's about the development of posts and their relation to transatlantic sailing, different routes, etc. Highly recommended. This is the first non-archival Connecticut postal marking. It's from Stratfield, Connecticut, June 2, 1746, and is rated 2 shilling and 8 pence after the New London town marking. This is a Connecticut local currency, which is nearly identical to the Massachusetts old penner. In fact, the rates are virtually the same. The rate from New London to Boston is 9 pence sterling, but accounts were settled at this point in time, in many cases, in tenor, because that's the only currency that people had. And this letter represents a 3.5-fold inflation over 9 pence. So 2 shillings and 8 pence, 2 times 12, so 24 pence plus another 8 pence is 32 pence. This is another letter in the Queen Anne period, and I like it a lot because I wrote the postmark. That's my handwriting. It's Philadelphia, 3 pennyweights and 16 grains. I became postmaster. I was offered the task of being postmaster of Philadelphia in 1737. My accounting skills were superior to prior postmaster Bradford's sloppy work, and Governor Alexander Spotswood asked me to be postmaster. He was postmaster general at the time. In the upper right-hand corner of this letter is the superscription 3 dot, and in the letter we see that this is a triplicate. That is, at least 3 copies of this particular letter were sent to James Alexander, Esquire, at New York. All of those letters went to different vessels, different routes, in an attempt to increase the likelihood that a letter would make it across the Atlantic at this point in time. Pirates, vagaries of weather, a lot of reasons why a lot of ships didn't make it all the way across. And we've seen in these last 3 letters at least 2 different currencies for rates. Sterling is the currency which is noted in the Queen Anne Act. There are 12 pence in 1 shilling. There are 20 shillings in a pound. The rates are described in that currency. Sometimes when letters go between colonies that do not share a local currency, the letters are rated in specie. 24 grains of silver equal 1 pennyweight. 1 pennyweight is equal to 3 pence sterling, and thus 4 pennyweights is equal to 1 shilling. It's all very confusing and was causing a great deal of difficulty with postal accounting, particularly when you realize that virtually all the colonies used their local money, as we saw in the Connecticut rating. This caused a significant problem such that little handbooks were issued. This is a correct table to bring old tenor into lawful money. It was printed and sold by Rogers and Fowle in Boston in 1750, which turns out to be a time period when fluctuations in currency were rampant. Fowle and companion, say the competing handbook sold at Neal and Green's is very erroneous. There being no less than 160 mistakes in 240 calculations. So please buy our book. This particular time period, the one pence sterling was equal to 7.5 pence old tenor. So a 7.5 inflation rate at this particular point in time. Well, being recognized for my skills managing the Philadelphia Post Office, I was, and John Hunter of Virginia, were asked to be deputies, Postmaster General of North America for the Crown, and we accepted and took upon ourselves to issue instructions to all the postmasters. These instructions sought improvement in service and sound financial procedures. We outlined detailed accounting steps. We outlined that postmasters would have the right of free franking, and that home delivery of letters not claimed could happen on the following day for a fee. We discussed the postwriter's schedule. We extended the line of the post to Savannah and to Falmouth in Casco Bay, which is now Portland, Maine. And most importantly, what we reviewed recently with currencies, we eliminated all local money ratings, and going forward, all letters were to be rated in specie. We got a little fine-tuned with some of our instructions. We told the postwriter to wind the horn thrice when he rode into town. Early in the reign, my BPMG, the 7 Years' War, broke out in England, known as the French and Indian War in America. And based on the success of the Dummer packet and the Bristol Harley packet, the Crown once again decided that it would be best to have a fleet of fast vessels to get intelligence back and forth between North America and England. The letters carried on the Falmouth packet would help to underwrite the service and cost of running the service. All letters would be bagged in London and prepaid and go by close bag to Falmouth, England, on the west coast of England, a lovely port where vessels don't have to deal with the southwesterlies, which would often delay a vessel in the English Channel, particularly when the English Channel was bordered by France. So the Falmouth to New York packet service began. First ships sailed Falmouth on December 13th, 1755, the date that this letter was written, but this letter was written too late to be carried from London to Falmouth to make that first sailing. Turns out that bad weather delayed the sailing of the next packet, such that this vessel, the vessel that carried this particular letter to New York, also carried the December and January mails. Arriving in New York, it receives a bold cancellation and is rated 3 pennyweights for the 9 pence by law trip to Philadelphia. Subscription per the packet via New York. Well, in America, Mr. Hunter and I have had some success getting the postal rates reduced. The law of Queen Anne states that there's an increment for every extra 100 miles, 100 to 200, 200 to 300, 300 to 400, etc. And those increments add up to a costly letter, particularly for the North American and Canadian distances. You could spend a month's salary sending a letter from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to Charleston or Savannah. So anyway, the act of King George got some of the postal rates adjusted, and it's a victory for myself, who lobbied the Crown authorities extensively to enact this law. This letter is from Philadelphia in red orange and postpaid, and it goes to Major Fundy, a trader on the Mohawk River. That address is sufficient enough to get this letter to him. The letter was mailed June 3rd, 1769, and prepaid, a wise idea for a letter going to a frontier outpost, particularly when the author of the letter is asking Fundy for a favor. Superscription on the letter says, to the care of Mr. Robert Clinch at Schenectady, who is requested to forward it per first opportunity, if he will greatly oblige his able servant, John Cox. I would mention that Clinch's Tavern in Schenectady still stands and was eventually the post office for Schenectady. Cox is asking Major Fundy to contact his Indian partners to harvest ginseng along the banks of the Mohawk River. Ginseng is all the rage in London, and Cox, a merchant in Philadelphia, tells Fundy that he can sell any amount at pleasing prices, and would he please hunt up some ginseng for him. So, fresh off my success getting the postal rates reduced in North America, this is another example of a letter which travels a distance which would have been a little bit more costly during the Act of Queen Anne. We're now in the period of the Act of King George III. This letter is from Jamaica, December 26th, 1765, and it's addressed to the Honorable John Moultrie, Esquire, Lieutenant Governor of East Florida at St. Augustine. At the end of the French and Indian War, the British received the East and West Florida from the Spanish, who were supporting France at that point in time. This letter is rated is a double weight letter, rated 1N4 for the 2 times the 8-pence trip to St. Augustine from Savannah, where the letter landed. Letter carried a document which was a review of the possessions of the estate of Moultrie's brother, who died in Jamaica, and his plantation assets were being transferred to Moultrie. As such, at this point in time, this document received some tax stamps. The paper was taxed, and on the left is a 9-pence quire paper tax. Quire is a form of amount of paper, but the more important tax stamp is the embossed one on the right. This is a 1 shilling American tax stamp, whereby every transaction of any kind, weddings, births, sales, would receive a tax of some kind, in this case 1 shilling, which would go to the Crown as compensation for prior expenditures dealing with wars in North America. This tax stamp infuriated all Americans except the tax stamp agents who were deriving income from it. Moultrie was a tax stamp agent for East Florida, and so he dutifully applied this stamp on the document that was to be in his possession. I worked hard to get the Stamp Act repealed, and eventually did so. And in reward for my efforts, I changed my franking designation. I changed the syntax of it from Free B. Franklin, which I had used as Postmaster of Philadelphia and Deputy Postmaster General of North America between 1737 and 1766. Free B. Franklin, I now use the syntax Be Free Franklin. Some have thought that this is a political, and in a sense it is, but it's really my happy notation to North America to be free. We're free of the odious tax at this point in time. Tax stamp agents were slow to give up their prized possessions and attempts at taxations. The people of many cities were in foment. Committees of safety were formed. Committees of correspondence were formed. And actually, militias began to drill. By August of 1774, the county of Worcester, west of Massachusetts, was in open revolt. Some tax agents had been physically abused, houses burned, and one fellow actually got tarred and feathered. This letter from Sturbridge is from a militiaman who reports to Mr. Asa Hamat that his troop was rallied outside the common of Sturbridge and was present in full regalia when Abijah Stone, the grandson of a Pilgrim general, Abijah was a tax agent for Sturbridge, and he was brought before the town and made to recant his office and surrender his tax stamp. And this letter was sent to Medfield with care and speed, hoping that it would be of interest to Hamat, a member of the Committee of Correspondence for Medfield. And so possibly this letter was carried on by a postwriter allied with the Committee of Correspondence and Safety. Didn't take long for muskets to fire. Lexington Concord happened in April of 1775, and Americans are now in open rebellion. Minutemen militias are streaming towards Boston, where the British have hunkered down, and they are now besieged. This letter from Albany to Montreal, May 6, 1775, is rated 10 sterling, an unusual designation, as we know that the Franklin Hunter instructions required specie, but this letter is going to a loyalist. It's from a loyalist, and it's still a Crown post office marking, but Albany is leaning towards patriot cause. But the letter is rated in Montreal, 10 sterling. This letter passes along a path that takes it very, very close to an important locale in New York on the border with Vermont. It wasn't Vermont at that point in time. But two brilliant war minds in the early days of the American Revolution identified that Fort Ticonderoga had numerous cannons, military stores, including gunpowder, cannonballs, etc. And this letter passed through a blockade set up by Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and militias from northwest Connecticut, soon to be joined by Benedict Arnold. Ticonderoga would fall on May 10th, 1775, without much of a battle, and all of the stores, all of the cannons, and all of the goodies at Fort Ticonderoga became possessions of the colonists, now in open revolt. Early in 1775, the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, still meeting in Philadelphia, passed acts whereby a number of vessels could be granted letters of marque. These became privateer squadrons. And this letter, headed to Nova Scotia by way of Rhode Island, was intercepted by the privateer squadron operating out of Machias and Eastport. This letter was opened by order of the Committee of Safety for Machias. James Lyon, chairman, Reverend Lyon, read the letter, found it to contain only commercial content, and allowed the letter to be placed back on vessel and was able to go to James Monk at Halifax in Nova Scotia. One of the other acts of the Second Continental Congress early on was to appoint me as Postmaster General. This happened on July 26th. And by the time this letter left Newburyport, August 11th, 1775, Ebenezer Hazard was installed as postmaster in New York. Mr. Goddard was appointed as a surveyor of the post, and he was riding north of Philadelphia to visit the posts and to settle them, which means to set up the books for the accounting and to swear in the new postmasters. This was not formally completed for Massachusetts until early November 1775. So this Cambridge, CAMB, postal marking is a marking of the Massachusetts Provincial Post going to New York, the Continental Congress Post Office, and then to Philadelphia. And the letter is rated 1 shilling and 8 pence, probably in Pennsylvania money for the trip from Cambridge via New York to Philadelphia. I think the letter probably was privately carried from Newburyport to Cambridge where it entered the post. This letter from March 9th, 1776 is from the Committee of Safety of Barnstable, Mass. And it reports to the Honorable John Hancock, Esquire, in Philadelphia. This letter is free. And on the other side, the back of the letter, is that turquoise New York hand stamp. But this letter to the President of the Continental Congress is a report by the Committee of Safety that Rochester Hill was taken last night with loss of 2 men. And remember those cannons, the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga? They were now able to be placed on Rochester Heights, able to fire easily down into Boston Harbor. Other cannons ringed Boston from the west and from the north. The bombardment was ready to begin, and the British would evacuate Boston on March 16, 1776. By May, early May, Massachusetts had declared its independence. And furthermore, friendly vessels had seen numerous troop transports out in the Atlantic headed towards St. Lawrence River Seaway opening. And this information was to be carried rapidly to Continental Congress in Philadelphia. So this document is a warrant from the Colony of Massachusetts Bay, Council Chambers, May 3rd, 1776. You are hereby directed to pay out of the public treasury of this colony to Mr. Jonathan Park to enable him to defray his expenses going express to Philadelphia, the sum of £12 to be accountable for the same. And the letter is signed by all of the members of the Massachusetts Committee of Finance, Caleb Cushing, John Winthrop, James Otis, James Bowden, Greenleaf, a lot of prominent folks there. Express letters were always allowed by law, and you had a chance to see one of the rate tables that I had printed up for, let's say, 1765. You'll see down at the very bottom, for all extraordinary letters and expresses sent along the post road, then the rates are mentioned. So express letters were always part of the post office, and this extraordinary document is how money was generated for such. And I'm happy to be Postmaster General of the Continental Congress. Here's my Free Frank, Be Free Franklin, once again, of a letter to Colonel Bull of the Pennsylvania Forces at Perth Amboy. Bull is commander of a quote, flying force, which is a rapid cavalry and wagon unit capable of moving swiftly to reinforce outbreaks of difficulty. The back of the letter has a Philadelphia, August 27th. Hand stamp. I am shortly going to leave for France, and this is one of the last letters of my Postmaster General Continental Congress office. So the American Post continues to struggle along, and this is an example of just one letter from 1780. The letters decrease in volume as there's at least two major British armies roaming around America in the southern part of America and certainly in New York City, and mail is decreasing in volume. A worse problem, however, is continental currency inflation. The response of the Continental Congress to inflation was to just print more paper money, which worsened the inflation. This is a letter during the 40-fold period, whereby the rates expressed in specie, 426 pennyweights, 16 grains, are 40-fold what the letter would normally would have cost in 1775. I like this particular letter because the superscription is from James Bryson, Assistant Postmaster General at the time, and he shows us how the letter is handled, where he received $24 for this letter. He's receiving a worthless currency for a letter that is rated this high because of the financial situation of the American forces. Well, Hancock in Philadelphia is attempting to help coordinate Washington's plans with the French in Newport. There's at least one French fleet under the command of Commodore Destouches. During the latter stage of the war, outbreak of military action in the Caribbean forces the English to send a second fleet to that area, thus allowing the Toulon fleet to escape a blockade at Gibraltar, and now a second French fleet is plying the waters of the Atlantic. And Hancock is doing everything that he can to coordinate the dance that's about to occur with combined French fleets and Washington. The war is not going well for the British in the Carolinas, and the British forces retreat down a peninsula between the York and James rivers, passing Williamsburg and landing, finally getting to Yorktown, which is at the opening of the Chesapeake region, and they hope to be saved by a still formidable British fleet who can offload them from the inhospitable landscape of Virginia and save them, but that's not to happen. This letter from September 8, 1781, under a flag of truce, is delivered to Governor Neilson. It's from Cornwallis and bears his frank. It's a plea for an exchange of prisoners. It indicates that all is lost for the British. They will shortly surrender a month hence, and the new nation's post will continue to struggle a bit, but its eventual success is no longer in doubt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, and Dr. Franklin, for a very engaging, very unique kind of presentation. So many great covers in there that we saw, some of the earliest posts. My first question, Tim, is that with all of that, and in keeping with the theme of our symposium, what do you consider the most interesting or important innovation during Franklin's time and during this time of the early post?
It was me, Ben Franklin. I corrected all the problems. I put sound financial backing. I created new post roads. I'm the hero. I guess, America found a way to integrate the population explosion that was happening, before the war started. Growth was enormous, and we were lucky to have good postmasters? I don't know. The Hunter Franklin instructions of 1753 put everything right in terms of accounting and record keeping that was wrong with the Queen Anne and wrong with the British tradition. It set the stage for sound growth, I think.
Why did the 1775 letter to Halifax go by way of Rhode Island? Did it stay on the same ship between Rhode Island and Halifax?
So the Triton is a marvelous little vessel. There are books, they are naval records of the American Revolution. And I think there are probably 9 or 10 volumes of this. Steve Walsky has another letter with a similar superscription on it, talking about the Triton being intercepted. I get the feeling that the Triton's captain, and the American privateers knew each other intimately. And every time the Triton sailed from the Caribbean up towards Halifax, he stopped off when he saw a privateer vessel. They exchanged letters and went on their merry way. And he was released every single time, according to the naval records of the American Revolution. It was his regular route.
This is a question for Dr. Franklin. What made you interested in becoming the Crown's Postmaster General in the colonies? Were you paid well for the job?
Well, there was a lot of opportunity. It was a post that I aspired to fill. I actually campaigned for it. At that point in time, I was also agent of Pennsylvania, for Pennsylvania to the Crown. I had a lot of business in London at that point in time. I was a member of the Royal Society. Part of my legacy that I have to live with is British thought I was too much of an American, and that's why they ultimately fired me in November of 1774. And early on, the Americans thought I was too British. I was involved in olive branch resolutions, trying to achieve a peace. My son was royal governor of New Jersey. I think I came a bit late to the revolutionary fervor. Certainly, if you talk to the Adams boys, they'll say they dragged me along. But once I got it, I'm an American.
We saw this on a few of the covers. What does QDC stand for again?
Quem Deus Conserva, may God protect. And there are all kinds of variations of that. WGP, just lots of things. They're all saying the same thing. It was God's mercy that some of those vessels made it across the Atlantic Ocean.
How common was it to use the Postal Service during the Revolutionary War as opposed to special military couriers?
Okay, well, I'm going to expand on that question just a little bit. So part of what I've done is I've gotten into a large number of archives across, I'm going to say, 8 states. And probably the amount of letters entering the post is probably less than 0.1%, maybe even 0.0011%. Letters traveling by post were extraordinarily expensive. Virtually no letters from clergy, about 3,000 letters in the Boston Public Library. Cotton Mather and his subsequent family and other clergy in Boston, not one of them has a postal marking, much to my chagrin and after hours of searching. Express mail during the Revolutionary War. Well, there are a number of letters that survived, with the express designation on them. But I think letters may not have had any designation at all and just be sent by military courier. Depends where the British were. New England mail to Philadelphia had to go up over New York around Fishkill, is where they got across over to northern New Jersey. Mail was not safe. Mail was being interrupted by the British all the time if it was near the shore.
What actions did Franklin take in regard to postal activity in Canada during the war?
A specific example is Franklin helped organize a postal attempt at Montreal. There's an example of a Montreal post office. I was able to find some examples of that. We wrote an article for the Chronicle about the very short-lived Congressional Post Office at Montreal. Hugh Finley was Postmaster General after I was fired by the Crown. I'm not aware of any mail going from congressional posts or Congress to Canada during this period of time, at least during the active war years. I remember right after that Albany letter from May of 1775, a British force strikes out from Quebec into Montreal. We abandoned Montreal rapidly, and they get pretty far. They get down past two forts towards Lake George, and then winter comes, and they retreat. They don't retreat; they retire to winter quarters in Montreal and Quebec. And then the following year, 1777, there's a major northern campaign that comes down from Canada, aiming to link with New York and cut the American Revolution in half. Thankfully, they don't succeed. I'm not aware of much mail going from combatant colonies into Canada at this point in time.
Another question that's sort of related to that. One of our attendees asked, what was the route from Albany, New York to Montreal, and how long would it have taken to get there?
Okay. So that comes up early on in my administration with the Falmouth packet. Hugh Finley's not there at that point in time, but Montreal and Quebec merchants complain about the time it takes letters to get from those two cities down to New York in order to reach the departing Falmouth packet. And Franklin asks the post riders to ride at night. And so he shortens that trip to about a week from prior week and a half, 2 weeks, 2 weeks and a half. So prior to the outbreak of war, there's concern about the time that it takes to get from Montreal straight south, Lake Champlain, Lake George, following the New York border, so to speak, east of the Hudson River until it crosses over.
How would a letter move from Jamestown to Philadelphia in the 1600s?
Well, it probably went by ship. Overland mail at that point in time is tricky. The swampiness of North Carolina prevents a lot of letters from not getting across. The mails from the northern colonies went to Annapolis and met a writer bringing the mails from the southern colonies, Charleston, and it was sort of in Annapolis that the mails got exchanged. There is a postal route that's advertised in the Philadelphia newspaper for local mail. I think it's 1734, 1736, at a time when Bradford is still postmaster of Philadelphia, whereby a writer would come down the western shore to Annapolis, cross over to Chesapeake, I think at Kent Island, and then come up the eastern shore back to Philadelphia. That's sort of a loop. That loop probably done on a monthly basis back in the 1730s. But mail from Williamsburg to Philadelphia has to get on the water to some degree because of the difficulties in North Carolina. Eventually, there are overland routes, but certainly not in the 1600s, the early 1700s.
What role, if any, did Native Americans play in carrying the post?
There's a marvelous letter in the Livingston correspondence that exists in the Gilder Lehrman Museum, which is now part of the New York Historical Society. And the letter is to one of the Livingstons at this point in time in New York City, and the letter is from Albany, and it's 1678, 16 something, and it's in Dutch. Very hard to translate ancient Dutch. And the letter is superscribed pour, P-O-R, pour D-E, Indian, I-N-D-I-E-E-N, Poost, P-O-O-S-T-E. And so there are Indians, Native Americans, carrying the mail for the Livingstons and eventually the Schuylers and everybody else, from Albany and regions, sites beyond Albany down to New York. The estimable Calvin Hahn, back in the 70s, wrote a lovely article about the Great Northern Post Road, which was the road from New York north to Albany and then on to Montreal. And he reports a number of instances where Mohawks are paid, 3 pence, three guilders, smaller amounts of currency for carrying letters rapidly up and down that route. So it's well known.
For all of those joining us for this session, we want to thank you for your attendance and ask that you join us on behalf of the 2020 Postal History Symposium, the American Philatelic Society, the American Philatelic Research Library, the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum, and the United States Classics Society in thanking both Dr. Franklin and Tim O'Connor.